Good afternoon.
Good afternoon, Paul.
How's everybody? It's your favorite time of the afternoon.
Lucky you.
Yeah. I don't know. I think this time is a little better than right after lunch. I think this is a better time than that. When I was in college, I took German right after lunch because we had to constantly talk, and that kept me from just zoning out. If I was going to sit in the back of a class lecturing at 1 o'clock, it was, but anyway. Good to have you here. I'm Paul Nixon. I live in Washington, D.C., and I work all over the place. People say, where do you live? I said, I'm a bouncing dot. I'm just all over the place. I think that I have worked in every conference but South Carolina at this point. So that's a little scary. New Mexico was one of my frontiers, and all of a sudden I got work in New Mexico. What were you saying? Oh, I do that to people regularly.
Why doesn't South Carolina?
I don't know. I don't know what's up with that. I have a person on my team who's from South Carolina. But the thing we're gathered around today is we're going to be looking at a program which is a partnership between Path One and Multiplying Churches in our connection called Churches Planting Churches. Okay, that's a big part of what we're going to be doing. And then also we're going to take the latter part of our time, and I'm going to do a little mini segment on a book that I wrote that is a resource for this program that I want to introduce you to. It's a book called Multi, and it deals with issues of increasing complexity in our society and how we as churches have to build greater capacity to be multi kinds of places. I'll say more about that in just a little bit. So where are we from? How many of you are in charge of new church development in a region of the United Methodist Church? Okay, we've got several of you, okay? District superintendents, church planters, great human beings. All right. Pastors from various places. Pastors of churches where you would like to see multiplication happening, maybe in the near future. All right. Any multi-site pastors present in the room, where you are pastor of a church or pastor in a cooperative parish where you're working kind of as a single ministry?
I planted a fresh expression that was a dinner church that was.
This counts. But are you still connected with it?
Yeah. Well, I just was reappointed to another church that still exists.
Okay. So you had the conventional experience of church, yes, mostly in a building, and then a fresh expression around a dinner church, yes, that was a part of that. Yes. That is a multi-site church, friends. That's what that is. And most of our fresh expressions are designed to be not to be pulled into the building, but they really need to be to be what they are, and to reach people that aren't coming in the house, folks. So what I've passed out is a little handout about Churches Planting Churches that we'll look at in just a moment. Thank you, Jan. Thank you. But one of the things that as I've been working across the UMC, one of the things I realized is, well, first of all, this denomination was born when I was 6 years old. So I'm giving away my age. And we have lost ground in terms of total number of people on our rolls every year since then. And I have a hunch that this is not going to be our best year this year, okay? Just thinking, all right? Okay. But yet, so much amazing ministry has happened in Methodism during that time. So it's kind of interesting. The overall trajectory has been kind of a general shrinking, but yet there's been a lot of great church planting. There's been a lot of growing churches. There's been a lot of amazing stuff. Some of you have been a part of that. So in 2006, I was sitting in one of these kind of meetings, and Bishop Tim Whitaker was speaking. And every now and then this happens when a denominational person is talking, and I just kind of zone out on their talk, like some of you may be about to do right now. I kind of zone out, and I have kind of a Holy Spirit moment, and I'm thinking, wait a second. And I just kind of, it becomes, the big event for me is what's happening there, and I kind of leave them talking, okay? It's happened several times for me. But Tim was talking, and I started writing an article entitled, I Refuse to Lead a Dying Church. which later I turned into a book the next year and published. But in I Refuse to Lead a Dying Church, the metaphor for me was, let's just say this is a field, okay? Let's say this is my backyard, all right? And it's just dirt, dead weeds, dirt. But for some reason, over here, there's grass. And it's happy and it grows and it's wonderful. But for the most part, it's dirt. Now, what can you say about my backyard?
It needs help.
Okay, it needs a consultant. Yes, it needs help. It needs the Holy Spirit. Rain. What can you say about my backyard?
It's dirty.
There's potential.
Conditions are better in
potential
one
there.
area than the rest.
Something good is going on over here.
Saw that.
Yeah.
That's where the dog goes at the back.
Maybe that's where, or the septic field. I mean, who knows what's going on over there? But for some reason, the overall area is kind of bleak, but if you reframe it over this way and just look at that area, in fact, there's life. And so, in looking at the churches we serve constantly, I believe we have to constantly reframe to ask, where is God alive? Where is God acting? Where is something new happening? We have to water that. We have to nurture that. There's always lots of dead wood, but in most places, there's something where we see the Spirit moving. And it's true in our denomination. Reframing, that book, I Refuse to Lead a Dying Church, it doesn't mean that I'll be the pastor of the whole thing. Some people said that the title of that book when they introduced me is I Refuse to Pastor a Dying Church. And I want to say, nope, that's not the title. The title is I Refuse to Lead a Dying Church. And what that means is I'm going to focus my leadership, not the funerals that I do and the hands that I hold, but my leadership is going to be focused on the life. Because you lead life, you don't lead death. Death doesn't do much. It just won't do much. But life, you can work with that. So constantly, we're looking for, in that book, the metaphor I used was the bright-eyed people. Where do you see people that are coming alive to the gospel? And you nurture them, you grow them, you disciple them. And that's the future of that church, is those people. Some people say, well, I've only got 3 or 4. Fine, okay. Let's make a list of them. And let's see if we can make that list 5 or 6. Let's see if we can't grow them and deepen them and create teams around them. Maybe we can get 10 or 12. We grow this. You cannot grow dirt. And a lot of our churches are not in a place where there's really anything to multiply or to grow. That's just not where they are. But you have to find the life in order to multiply something. And so when you think about the life, you're thinking about there's discipleship going on here. There's leaders being developed here. There are converts discovering Jesus here. There's great mission and service happening to others. But all of that's happening. If you grow this, you're growing all of this. So in this church, as a denomination, even though there's been a lot of decline, we have some amazing stories of multiplication. And so what we have said is, let's take some places where, in a variety of parts of the country, different cultural situations, they're finding ways to grow ministry. They're finding ways to share gospel. They're finding ways to do all of these things and to plant new congregations that are a part of networks often. We have found that the multi-site strategy, and by multi-site I mean one chartered church that operates with ministry in multiple locations, none of which may have a building. Or there may be one, or there may be multiple buildings, but there are multiple points where ministry happens. One of those points could be what we call an anchor, or which becomes kind of usually it's the larger, and it's the point from which usually we have some DNA that is going to basically drive what happens in these places. If we don't have DNA in the anchor, and all we've got at this point right here is just a church that pays apportionments and a good salary, and they've kind of stayed strong, that alone is not going to be helpful at all in terms of the behaviors and the motivations that's going to help us do something else. So in this zone, we have churches. Those churches can be anchors. Those churches can multiply, and often they do. And so when we look around, we see churches like the Gathering in St. Louis, where we're about to do a summit, or like Edenton Street in Raleigh, where we just did a summit, or like First Church Boise, Idaho, where we will do a summit next year, or like First Church McKinney, Texas, where I started out in ministry in that county, and in those days they called it my counseling elder. Basically, that was my big brother mentor guy who was the pastor at Glenn Vickers, the pastor at First Church. They ran 290 in worship and had for 100 years. And it was the doctors and the lawyers and the blue-blooded people, okay? And that church in that little sleepy town, the growth got there from Dallas. Dallas finally got there, and McKinney went from being a little place to a big place. And most of the time when that happens, our churches just go, whoa, and they keep doing the same thing. The growth doesn't usually drive much change because we have our little thing going, and besides, there's only so much room in the sanctuary, which doesn't feel like a whole lot bigger than this, and it is a little bit bigger, but you can't put more than 275 people in there, and it's just so charming. And my grandmother was baptized there, you know. So we get kind of locked into a space, and the town grows up around us. Well, so I checked in with McKinney a few years ago, and they were running 1,800. I said, whoa, what happened there? And what happened there is like 10 worship services. What happened there is a church that transitioned from being a sleepy downtown First Church anywhere USA to being a church that looked outside itself and really said, hey, we've got a mission here. God is sending people to this community. We need to reach, we need to serve those people. So McKinney was our first summit. McKinney was a church, First Church McKinney, that was in this space, and we said we can use, and they were functioning as an anchor church and sending out. Their whole thing is to evangelize Collin County, and to do that by planting new sites. That's their vision, their ministry. So as we were thinking about that, we said, well, if you can do that, maybe you can train some others of us, tell your story, and help some others of us to learn your mistakes as we are thinking about creating multi-site churches. So we do these summits in these various places with these kind of churches, and we are continuing to innovate around how we do that. We have in this room Dan Pizzette, works as one of our coaches with the summits. So when we come together to do a summit, we come together for 4 days, and we bring churches that have basically applied to be a part of it, and they come together with teams of 4. So this is like a group from a church. This is like a group from a church. You're looking just like one of our rooms. In fact, we have 5 tables in here. This would be about the size of a typical summit, plus the teaching team from that church where we are. And we spend 4 days over a weekend learning, asking lots of questions, huddling, asking, what does this mean for us? What does this mean in our context? And then out of that, we begin to make some plans. Well, you come to find out that this church and this church are in very different contexts. And the church that's the teaching, the host church, is in a different context. So the first point is that we're not here to copycat what they do in McKinney or in St. Louis. I have a church coming to St. Louis that is from Las Cruces, New Mexico. And they are partnered with a church in Truth or Consequences, New Mexico, which is 75 miles away, but in New Mexico time, that's just a quick trip to Walmart, basically is what that is. And they're now becoming a multi-site church, kind of moving into being a cooperative parish, but operating with kind of one staff and church philosophy. They're coming all the way to St. Louis. You think with the stuff that's worked inside the city limits of St. Louis is going to be the plan that works out in Las Cruces where you got to drive 75 miles to go to Walmart? No. but they're going to learn some systems. They're going to learn some principles, and they're going to apply that. We assume that every church that comes to these things is not going to be learning it's not like you're learning a tight process that you go back with a manual, but you're learning some basic principles that you then apply with good leadership in your context. And so folks like Dan are helping to guide that conversation as the church leaders work in cohorts over several months after attending the summits, as they're kind of working out their plans. Okay? That's the big idea. We said, let's leverage these great churches in our midst, and we have some amazing ones. For all of the drama and the negative news stories that go on, we've got this great ministry that goes on across our denomination. We're trying to lift up those churches, and believe it or not, there's some other ones besides the Church of the Resurrection. And the Church of the Resurrection is a marvelous place, okay? I am all for it, and they're not one of our churches. Why not? They're not one of our summit sites. I mean, they might be, but they're not in the first few years. Why not? Why not the Church of the Resurrection? They're amazing. They do everything good. Why not? Why not them? What if I'm a church of 75 people in upstate New York, and I want to go to Leawood, and there's 10,000? Yeah. And it seems like money and budget just on and on and on. It is. It's intimidating. So we've had a church, one of our best churches, Dan is working with them, as a church up in upstate New York with about 75 to 90 on Sunday. They're awesome. You know, that is your church, yes? You're not working with them? Okay. I thought he was. Well, they're awesome. And they were planted about 12 or 15 years ago. They're a small town church. They look at the town down the road from them, and they say, they need one of these, and we want to put it there. Now, when we think about multi-site, usually we're thinking about the big churches, but the fact is you can do this on any scale. And we want to help them to do that. So really, any church from any context can go anywhere. Each of the summits that we go to teach different things. Matt Miofsky in St. Louis is going to teach us how to do video venue. Does that mean we're all going to go home and do that? Probably not. The majority of multi-sites don't use video venue, but he's really good at it, and it's really neat to learn and watch how they do that. And I worked several years ago with a church in Elko, Nevada, okay? And this church in Elko had a vision of planting offsites that would kind of go all through rural Nevada, but those were going to meet basically in a cafe with a banjo and a DVD player. That's a video venue, okay? And with 13 people. And the cost is $0, okay? And the elder that oversees that whole thing has a car that, you know, you can, and the highways are excellent in that state, and you can get from one place to the other, and you can serve communion, and you can go and, you know, tend to your flock. But by doing multi-site, you have a way to leverage the resources of one gifted apostolic kind of pastoral leader. You could serve a fourth of the state of Nevada, okay? So, anyway, this is the big idea. The big idea is that we work with these folks, and so that's what we're trying to do. The first round is completed. We had 100% compliance of the churches that came, that they completed the process. If you've ever done any kind of organizing of events that then have ongoing follow-up and cohorts, if you get 50%, it's very, very good. But we got 100. I was really pleased with that. So they're each doing different things. And some of them are saying, we're not quite ready to just go and launch something. So we have prep work. But they've got an agenda of what they're trying to do. Behind me, flashing on the wall, is a series of quotes, advice from multi-site pastors that we collected as we were starting this project. That's what's going on behind me. Scott Crossteck is at Church of the Resurrection. We know that every time that we do a multi-site, and it is the most, because of the continued linkage to the local, and because it's primarily running on local energy and not cabinet initiative, we know that the success rate of the new start is going to be high. It's going to be the highest there is. And it's getting harder and harder to plant new things. So we really are, we know that this is the best shot we have at taking the resources we have and planting new communities, is to link them together. We also know that you can link churches together across a considerable geographic distance. And we're learning how to do that at further and further kinds of distance. Right now, Embrace Church in Sioux Falls, in the Dakotas Conference, has an offsite, one of its campuses in Minnesota Conference in Minneapolis area. It's 4 hours if you're driving fast between Sioux Falls and Minneapolis. I think the jury's still out whether or not they would do another one of those that far away, because it's a significant cultural and geographic distance. It's hard to partner, but it worked. It worked, and being connected with Embrace certainly helped that to work. But it's been a harder plant than when they were going 20 miles down the road. Anytime that we're doing this kind of work, there's two things that we have to pay attention to. This is really where we are trying to help them. One is there has to be a common DNA that stretches across the church. And also there has to be a sensitivity in each place that it's a different place. Every place is different. And every neighborhood has a different demographic, it has a different ethos, and you can, if what you do is such that it's going to relate to a lot of people, you've sort of designed it to be a big tent kind of experience, you might be able to almost clone it like you're starting a new McDonald's, and that'll work. But most of the time, that's not how we do church. We do church in a little more customized way, and so we have to ask, what is the big picture? What is the DNA? What is the core stuff that does not change from place to place? And then how do we give freedom to each place to express that in a way that still feels in sync so that we can be one church? There has to be more common ground to do a multi-site than there is to do a denominational network. It's more than that. We are one team, often preaching the same message on Sunday with different human beings, with the same basic, not just the same text, but the same outline, the same big ideas. So in order to do that, we have, there's the sameness. Greg Moore in North Carolina talks in terms of homoousia and heteropersona. He gets into Trinitarian theology, that basically God works like this. There's the sameness and there's also the differences. Well, it's true certainly when you do multi-site church. And if there's too much sameness or too much difference, there's going to be a conflict. The key relationships that make a multi-site work, what relationships would those be? If you were going to pick some relationships that, boy, that better be healthy, what would be some key relationships? Anybody?
Campus pastors and anchor pastor.
Campus pastor and anchor pastor. And almost all of those things behind us have to do with some of that. When I was a multi-site pastor back in the late 90s, I had been the executive pastor working with a pastor for several years, and we had a very easy and trusting relationship, so that it was very easy for me to move into that campus pastor position. We did not always preach the same stuff. Knowing what I know now, we would have, but we did not. But there was still a sense in which we were aligned, and we knew never to get triangled, ever. And we knew how to avoid that. And so it was fine. But then I got pulled into a church development job for the conference. And a year later, Herb got pulled into cabinet as a district superintendent. And we had two new characters that were playing the role of, And they did not have that relationship that we had. And so there began to be tension. And then this first campus, but then we had a second one, and there was tension there. It got quite interesting. But the part of what happened was this campus had stopped growing for a variety of reasons. It was landlocked. It was in an older part of town. This campus was growing like gangbusters, and then we had a new one that started growing pretty fast. And that, with new people that did not have the trust, and this campus starting to slow down, this pastor was feeling pressure and feeling some intimidation. And that began to make awkward the relationship. This pastor changed, and it got better for a season, and then it changed again, and it got a lot worse. Today, that church, finally, these folks shook hands, and this church spun off. And they run more than 1,000 on Sunday, so it's not a sad story. I mean, you planted a church with more than 1,000 on Sunday. It's a good thing. This church is doing better, I think. And they also had another campus. It was a beach campus that split when out of the tension, the pastor that was there left the denomination with 2/3 of the group. But he left a group that decided to stick with it, and so there's still a beach campus. So you still have a 2-campus church. You have 4 congregations, and you have easily double the number of people that are worshiping on Sunday that were represented in this church when we decided to go multi-site. So that's a gain. Yes?
Could you talk about why you thought it was a mistake not to preach the same message in all the campuses?
It would have, I think, because we were about to go through, it was working for us. We were working on the power of our trusting relationships. But we did not realize that when we left, we were going to need more structural habits to keep us aligned than our relationships, because those relationships were no longer of any value to that church. So new people come in, but if those new people came into a situation where there were already some established practices of how we work together, it would have been much, much easier. The other thing I will tell you is that in several parts of the country, including North Carolina Conference, and also this conference up in the northern part, we have multi-sites that are essentially cooperative parishes. So basically the churches remain chartered churches, multiple chartered churches where there's a board of trustees that still gets together to talk about the leaky roof. Okay? But you have a common staff that serves the whole thing. You have a common name that serves the whole thing. So in northern Pennsylvania, you've got Benton, Waller, and Town Hill. So you have the Benton UMC, Waller UMC, Town Hill UMC, but you have the well at Benton, the well at Town Hill, the well at Waller. And what happens with that is they say one movement in 3 churches. The well is a movement that combines 3, and you could put 4. Because of that, when they get together in a team conversation at the well, they're not talking about the leaky roof. They're not worried about buildings. That conversation is still happening. The people that were concerned about that can still be concerned about that. That's happening in a different room. And I might say at a lower altitude. Meanwhile, those churches are continuing to grow in their synergy with one another, and I predict that the well together will surpass 400 in worship, out basically in the middle of nowhere, which I think is really a hopeful model for rural Methodism, which we need some hopeful models for rural Methodism. And the population is not growing in north central Pennsylvania. It's just not. Probably it's less people in most of that territory than lived there 20 years ago. And yet a church is growing because great ministry is happening there. And in that case, one of those churches was significantly revitalized. And it has the DNA that is now basically impacting and transforming the churches that join up with it. Yes?
So follow-up question on that, in terms of DNA and contextualization, because we have a church that is doing exactly this church planting, planning to use, projecting the sermons from lead pastor of anchor pastor over to the campus church. And at the same time, when we ran the mission insight information on the 2 communities, vastly different demographics and populations.
Okay, we're back to Las Cruces and Truth or Consequences. Vastly different, okay?
And So at what point are you broadcasting the DNA of the organization versus contextualizing the ministry? I mean, you talk about, yes, this happening here, and then the nuts and
There
bolts
has to
happening
be
at a level.
a significant sensitivity to the differences in place. There just has to be. Now, in any place, there's a range of folks. And so if a church from point A is doing a ministry in point B, there's going to be some overlap, even though it's a very different community. We're not going to be able to reach everybody there. That's just not the way church is designed. It takes more than one. But so a little bit of the personality of that church is going to be skewed because it's connected to this one. And at the same time, that we want that church to be asking out here, who is our community? What does it take for us to be faithful, to be different? And we want to see some differentiation. But, I mean, there will be some similarity that will keep this church from reaching certain people because it's connected with this church over here. So I've told this story many times, which most of you haven't heard it, but when I was doing this, back the original congregation, the Anchor Church, had 45 doctors because we were near a hospital. And so the new campus, which grew to be just as big, had 0 doctors, but we had 4 professional wrestlers. Now I want you to stop and think about that. Wow. Yeah, very, very different demographic. And yet, and ultimately, I think the demographics probably, as we were faithful in both those places, probably were one of the reasons that church did need to spin off and become an anchor of its own. But at the same time, it worked. We didn't see a need to be duplicating ministry, but we were working off of similar values and similar practices. And there was some overlap, but there were significant differences.
So follow up on the follow-up. Because I think we're getting at the same thing. So, we love to use the language DNA. We got to spread the DNA. I want you to get very specific about what does that mean?
Okay. Well, there's a whole piece around that we do, and that's a great question. We planted him, folks. There's a whole piece that we do with that. It's around a tool that's called Readiness 360. Readiness 360 was a study of churches that multiply and what are behaviors and habits that are common among the churches that multiply, that inconvenience themselves to do new things, to involve new people. Why do some churches do that and have a good time? And other churches do that and get in the middle of a conflict or just won't pull it off. What's the difference? And so we did that study, and there is a survey that's based on that study that we have. But there's 4 big pieces to the DNA, okay? And the Readiness 360 is a big way that we measure that. And that's readiness360.org. But the 4 are spiritual intensity. It's basically the habits of spiritual practice. Intensity. Okay, there's an E in there somewhere. Okay, I got that. Okay, secondly, it's relational habits. We call it, but it's relationships. What is the capacity of that church to do gospel relationships, to be life-giving relationships between the staff and the church at large, between the church and the neighbors? What's the nature of relationships? Is it a grace-filled place? Is it a judging place? Is it a place where you can get on board and get involved easily? What's the relational competency of that church? Third one is what we call missional alignment. Is that church able to make decisions in terms of what we're going to do and what we're going to stop doing based on effectiveness? Based on, is this getting us anywhere toward what we say we're in the business of doing? Okay? That's a missional alignment. And some churches are very good at that. Most churches are not that good at that. And then the 4th one, and the most challenged for everybody, and that's where the multi-book comes in, is what we call cultural openness, or just intercultural competencies. But basically, how can we be church with folks who have a different narrative than we do? Their life's just different than our life, and how can we bring multiple kinds of groups together? I'm going to do a little talk on that at the end of our time, which is getting closer. So we put all four of those together. We have a pretty good way of getting a baseline in terms of whether this is a church that would likely have a good time or it's a church that needs to do some work yet. That tool, we use that tool in the churches planting churches, but there's also several annual conferences that have contracts with Readiness, and also, even if you don't, you can still use it. It's not expensive, and I think 1,300 congregations, mostly United Methodist, have done that study. And because of that number that have done it, we've been able to norm it, and it's really predictive. I mean, it just really tells you what's going to likely happen if you try to stretch that church and to invite them to climb a mountain together in order to reach some of their neighbors. And what you discover is some of those churches, they're going to get winded and they're all going to faint, before they get to the first foothill. Yes?
A friend of mine has asked the question often, how do you measure success in these situations, in these new churches or these anchor churches and multi-sites? How do you measure that success, or is there success?
Well, I think you measure success the same way you measure it in ministry in general. How do you measure success? You measure it by how many people get called into ministry to start new ministries. How many people came to faith in Christ and were baptized? I mean, how many, it's the same kinds of metrics or measures that you would have for any ministry. If we're coming together to do this, if it's a vital merger, which can be one of the ways that we do multi-site, is it going to create more discipleship behavior? Is it going to impact the town in measurable ways? But the things you measure will be a little different depending on the kind of the focus of your ministry, but you measure the same stuff. And if going multi-site is not growing is not scaling up the church's ministry, then I begin to wonder, why exactly are we doing that? We're just spreading out the same number of people that we had. Is that going to be efficient or not? So I don't know, but I would measure it the same way that I measure any kind of ministry. And often, Ken Nash is running around this place. If you have a chance, he's a great guy. Ken says we do multi-site, number one, because we're outgrowing a place, and it's just easier rather than to go into a capital campaign, to create another place at a much lower cost in a new neighborhood and keep going. And quite honestly, folks, we do have to renew these older buildings that we have to a point, but we go to capital campaign way too fast some of the time. And I like capital campaign. I've given to capital campaigns. I believe in them. They're exciting when it's the right thing to happen to help a church go to the next level. But very often, we could be spreading out across the land rather than building a bigger thing. And so he says number one reason is you're overflowed in one place, you're going to go to another. If you're overflowing in a place, it's often, not always, but often a sign that there's a vitality that's there. There's probably some of these good things happening if people are packing the house out. Okay, so to look at the handout that went around, may I borrow yours just real quick? This gives you kind of a little sense of what we're talking about. Basically, it's $26.95. One of the things I want you to hear is we will customize this process for any annual conference that wants to work with us to do so. And we'll bring it to a place near you. So if your annual conference says, man, we'd love to have this close to us, but we can't send people to California or wherever, then say, okay, what's something that's drivable from your location, a church that you really like the style of what they're doing? We'll work with them, and we'll work with you. And so we'll align it. We'll build in emphases that are part of your local culture and language in your conference. For example, when we did this with North Carolina Conference, it was called the Anchor Church Summit, not Churches Planting Churches Summit, because Anchor Church is what they do. They're trying to teach healthy churches to multiply to other places. That's their thing. That's one of their major things. So we use that language. And they also have some other practices that we lifted up there that are very contextual to them. But we brought a church from Alabama and a church from near where the Pilgrims landed at Cape Cod, and then one from Pennsylvania. Three unbelievably healthy congregations came and joined those churches in North Carolina, and we had a summit together. And each church pays $26.95, and that includes the coaching and the 4 days for the team of 4, and that they work to get to the event. Readiness 360 is included in that, and basically that's the gist of it. There you go. Any questions about that process? Just know that I will explore with you. So what I'd like for you to share with your neighbor as you share about that is to say, as I think about this as a possibility for churches in my conference, one question I have is, talk to your table.
It's that time of day.
At least in my opinion.
Yeah. I'm with it.
I was texting Jay. Well, that's interesting. Yeah, because our whole point is like drive everybody to this point. We have some pieces that we
Yeah, in fact, I had several people I sent to Paul to try to get them invited.
I don't believe any of them are going to do it this round, but I think they're interested. I just think it's not time yet for them.
Yeah,
They just felt like.
Paul, as we were talking, especially at North Liberty, Alicia, she has some health concerns that are part of that, and also a lot of concern about what's going to happen.
That's really slowing a lot of folks down right now because they're afraid if we lose 20% of my money, I'm going to get overextended. Yeah, that's the biggest thing. So, okay, 30 seconds, and we're going to come back together.
Because I was thinking, because Jay was asking that, so I was just, I mean, that's all, and he's got like just like a drive to do it, and they have
Well, they
I thought they were interested in like the last I thought they were.
Okay. So, as we're thinking about church multiplication, I want us to acknowledge the fact that we have done some good work with that in the last 200 years plus in the United States of America. That we have been a place of really almost unprecedented nimbleness and innovation around church planting in the United States. Partly because we do church in so many different flavors in the United States. And probably more than just about any other country on earth. There's just there's all kinds of different flavors and microcultures that come together to be church. And if a new group of people comes to the United States and they speak a new language that no one's ever spoken, they'll be organized into a church by Friday, you know. And the church will be initially a place where they'll come together to have a little bit of the old country, but they'll come together in faith. And then any other folks that are friends or any kind of cultural acquaintances of them will get brought into that. Many of them will become Christians here and connected with that. And we see that over and over and over. But because of that, Our churches, even though we have a good history of planting, and especially around affinity, and what Don McGavran used to call the homogeneity principle, because of that, our churches are the least diverse subsegment of our society. They are a bunch of little subcultures. And that's becoming a problem for us in a splintered society. It has been our advantage, but now it's becoming a challenge. And to do church well in the 21st century, you have to have more multi-capacity than you used to, especially if you're not going to pick up and move every 40 years. If you're going to build a church and try to do ministry here, you better get used to the fact that this neighborhood is going to look different 40 years from today than what it does right now. And 40 years after that, it's going to look different again. And it's not going to be, usually it's not one homogeneous group leaving and another homogeneous group coming. We saw that maybe 75 years ago, but today the neighborhood just gets more and more diverse. And part of the reason that the church that used to have 300 on Sunday now has 75 is because they served one flavor of ice cream that made sense to everybody in that neighborhood, but now that neighborhood is so diverse, there is no one flavor of ice cream that's going to work for all those people. There's just a lot more diversity in the neighborhood. Plus the churches tend to get older, and then that makes it harder as well. We have to create churches with multi-capacity, or what Julian Davies, that I'll introduce you here, would call multivalence. Julian was a guy that I coached as a church planter. But to back up just a little bit, before he was a Christian, he was the distinguished professor of chemistry and natural sciences for the University of Toledo, Ohio. Okay? Put that on a business card. And he was an atheist on Tuesdays and Thursdays and an agnostic on the other days of the week. And one day, he married a United Methodist woman. And where did she take him? She did. And he sat there, and one day he honestly, if you know Julian, he raised his hand in church, and she said, "You can't do that here. We're in church." But he was a professor. He came out of an academic setting. The preacher was talking about something. He didn't make any sense. He wanted to ask a question. He asked questions. To make a long story short, the questions were answered. They made sense. He was converted. He ended up at Asbury Seminary. He gave up his career to follow God into ministry. Came back to West Ohio Conference and plants a church adjacent to the University of Toledo, University United Methodist Church, where he still is to this day. Now, because he's got this ministry experience and he's got this chemistry experience, and we're thinking about multivalence as a metaphor for how we bring all this together, I said, whoa, I need to talk to Julian, because he understands the world of chemistry and how stuff sticks together. And he also understands ministry. Let's talk about multivalence. And so we had a little chat the beginning of last year, and we're talking about multivalence, which is a chemical term as a metaphor for how we get things to stick together. And if you're going to do multi-site, what I learned quickly as I began to think about writing a book on it, it's more than just location. It's how we can be one and yet be different. Because you add location, you're adding a significant point of difference, because neighborhoods just tend to be different. Okay? And so, multivalence. It is the capacity of atomic elements to bond with one another. Okay? That's multivalence. Now, there are every basic element on the periodic table has a little tiny number attached to it. You remember that little number? Like a 4 or a 2, 0. Argon and neon have 0. That means they are inert elements. They don't play with any other elements. They're happy, they're content, they have their potluck dinner, and they go home. No mission, nothing, okay? They're closed shell. So that's the term that Julian used, as the chemists would call a valence of 0 a closed shell. We can relate to that kind of church. Okay, that kind of church, bless their hearts, send them a part-time fill-in, pastor, but don't trying to make a closed shell a missional outpost is sometimes not a very good idea. Okay, so meanwhile, though, carbon has a valence of 4, okay? Which means that the carbon atom can attach to 4 different things at once, and that can attach to things and attach to things and make these amazingly complicated molecules that just get more and more complicated until you get this room. You get human beings. It is the basis with which God builds life, carbon, okay? So we got to pay attention to that. A valence of 4, if you're going to be building some life, is better than a valence of 0. You're not going to get very far with 0. But a valence of 6, we're talking uranium now, is getting a little bit unstable, and you can blow up your garage with that stuff, okay? Which is to say that an infinitely rising valence of all these different kinds of people all under one roof in one church may not be God's first design for us. Hear this, folks. To be infinitely diverse under one roof works for about a day. That day is called Pentecost, and then we organize into congregations, okay? But congregations do not have to be homogeneous units of everybody being little mini clones walking around. We can tolerate and do diversity because the Spirit does that, okay? And it's the Holy Spirit that really empowers multivalence. But a valence of 6, you're getting quite a juggling act. If we had more time, I have a little survey that I have people take about different kinds of multivalence, and sometimes we'll have someone in the room that will check all these things about their church, and they'll say, "I think we've got a valence of 7," and we'll all say, "Oh, we're going to pray for you." And they begin describing their church, and it's quite a juggling act of things. All the electrons in an atom have to be constructively used in the bonding, or they will begin to try to repel. Okay? So everybody's got to be in the game, or they will play against the bond, and loose and idle electrons make mischief. Just briefly, types of multivalence we see in churches. Obviously, multi-site is an issue of multivalence. And so if you have a relatively homogeneous church that you do a multi-site, you're probably going to begin to see some different kinds of socioeconomics or other kind of human dynamic that's going to come in just because you change neighborhoods. Multilingual. Anyone ever been a part of a church where there was more than one language in that church? It can be very interesting. I was a part of a church plant that was fewer people than those in this room. We were in a living room, and it started with a guy from Mobile, Alabama, and his wife was from Venezuela, and they Spanish and English, and we had a room full of people, some of which were bilingual, some of which spoke only Spanish, some of which spoke only English, and it worked. It was a church. It came together. Multilingual church. Multi-narrative church is a church with people that have different stories and they're listening to each other's stories. So often those early homogeneous churches, everybody had the same story. We all just arrived here from the other country. We're all farmers out in the middle of Iowa in this little town, and we're all growing corn, and it's not rained in a long time. We're all telling the same story, and the football team won, and it was the same team because we're all in the same town. Same narrative, folks. And very, very easy. But what about when you get a church where there's a lot of different narratives, a lot of different stories? If you're not building relationship capacity and getting people listening to those different stories, you can't do that. That kind of church is not going to work. So a multi-narrative church is able to hear different kind of stories and to say, wow, that's pretty cool. That's different than what my story is. Multi-liturgical, that's a church that worships in different ways. We see some of that. But that was a challenge 20 years ago. You remember some of those conversations? Some of those conversations were not so nice. They even called them worship wars, people. Multi-theological. I find it interesting that there is a theological range of people almost in every church. Some churches have a more narrow range. Some churches have a little more latitude. Many of the non-denom churches that we think are so narrow, they're not that narrow. Their brilliance is that they're clear on their fundamental things. And then they allow quite a bit of latitude around those things. Plus, Americans being the way we are buffet eaters par excellence, and we just say, that's broccoli and I don't eat that, and they just move on. They don't worry about it. Their kids are having a good time in children's church. They're growing as disciples. So the preacher preached this about that. Yeah, whatever. They just leave it on the buffet and they keep going. So multi-theological churches that have that capacity are going to be easier to be multivalent. We're seeing the birth of the multi-ethnic church for about the last 100 years, but it's really coming out of the ground fast now. And the Journey Church here in Harrisburg, if you stay for Sunday, is a multi-ethnic church, and it's going to be lovely to watch it bloom. But the fact is, if you go all the way back to Azusa Street Revival in LA back in 1906, it was kind of like the American Pentecost moment, and we had never seen anything like it. And it was kind of on the wrong side of downtown LA in a dusty little street in this little church. They came together across racial lines. They came together preaching across gender lines. We had women preachers. We had black people and Hispanic people preaching to white people. We had poor people and rich people, and it was all there. And you had the beginnings of the modern Pentecostal movement, but you also had the beginnings of multi-ethnic church, and we are seeing that continue to rise. And in the multi-ethnic church is a very tender and wonderful thing. It is built by God, and it has to be built table by table by table. And when I say table, I mean by the leader table. It is the leader table that does all of this. But multi-generational, if you have a bunch of old folks trying to lead a multi-generational church, figure out what the young people want, it's not going to work. There was a church in Baltimore that I worked with that wanted to have a community fair, kind of a block party. And they had a bouncy house. And I came back to ask, how did it go? I was sitting around the table, and they said it didn't go well. It was just only the church people came. The neighbors wouldn't come. I said, what's wrong with your neighbors? They said, they're all on drugs. I said, they can't all be on drugs. And even if they are, I mean, their kids love the bouncy house. I mean, come on, what really happened here? And finally I found out was the group of church people got together and decided what a good block party would be. And they didn't invite the neighbors. They didn't involve the neighbors. Basically, I think they did some like door hangers, but it was impersonal. The neighbors weren't involved in it at all. The ministry design table has to involve the people we're designing ministry for. This is true for all of the various kinds of multivalence we do. As goes the leader table, as goes the launch team, will come the church. So intentionality about building a launch team that's multi-generational, building a launch team or a leadership team that's multi-ethnic. I tell the story of one of my favorite churches I've worked with is Cornerstone Church on the north side of Toronto. It was a Cantonese language plant, coming out of a Cantonese first generation Hong Kong people church downtown Toronto. These are the kids of those people. They're beginning to marry across ethnic lines. Their friends are all kind of different folks. And they said, we want a church that looks like our neighborhood. And we don't speak Cantonese out here. We still eat the food, but we speak English, okay? So this church comes together. It's 90% Asian people. And they say, that's our desire, our goal. God's stirring in our hearts, calling us to be a church that looks like the neighborhood. So the first thing they did was they built a multi-ethnic staff. And then they began to, as people would join that church, they recognized that, I'm going to run through some slides real fast here. Let's see if we can, that is stuck. Okay, that's not good. Let's see, maybe. There we go, we're moving fast. But they began to realize that there's a thing called host culture. And host culture means that we come from an Asian Christian context. That's who we are. It's who we've been historically. But God is calling us to be a church for the neighborhood. So do we stop being an Asian church and become a different kind of church? I mean, you hear the tension here? Every church is always wondering about this. We've been a church that was German. We've been a church we were a church that was a historic black church involved in the civil rights movement. Now the neighborhood's changing and all this. Are we to let go of that and become just the neighborhood? What do we do with that? You name the host culture. So Andrew Lau, who is the pastor at Cornerstone, in his PhD at Edinburgh, came up with this idea that church has to have a host culture. And in the host culture, we're saying we are historically coming from the tradition of Chinese Christianity, 20th century Chinese Christianity, which is arguably the most virulent strain of Christianity we've seen in a while. I mean, it just went crazy. From the time of the Cultural Revolution to now, I mean, just millions and millions and millions of people. So, we're coming from that. We want to give everybody a dose of that around here. And at the same time, we understand that as more and more people come in, we will more and more be a church that is going to be whatever God wants it to be. So best practices for host culture, and every anchor church has a host culture as they plant in a new place, folks. Every church that's planting a new worship community for new folks, there's still a host culture. There's the people that pay the bills. There's the people whose grandparents went to church around there. There's host culture in most churches, okay? And so an awareness, naming it, a commitment to hospitality, intentionally empowering leaders from the outside, owning certain aspects of the host culture, which can be offered as gift, which could be the music, it could be the food, it could be the Christian practices, it could be the whatever it is that's special that you want to pass along, that's a part of that heritage. You don't have to stop being what you are in order to welcome new people in. I love this concept of host culture. And understanding finally the church belongs to God, and if a bunch of people, if we get swamped with new people coming to Christ, our church will change. And we're willing to risk that and to even bless that because it's more than us. It's, the church belongs to God. The leader team has to covenant around practice, especially if it's going to be a diverse team. We are going to work out all of the kinks of being church within diversity. We're going to work it out at this table. In the terms of a multi-site church, we are going to work it out with people from the different campuses. The campus pastors are really going to have to work out their stuff in a trusted and respectful way. So we covenant around practice. Affinity doesn't mean we're alike. It just means we're clear about what we have in common. Okay, and we live into that in the common denominators. We're growing towards spiritual maturity. We're spending time in relationship. We're modeling the key valences around our table. We believe that the whole is greater than the parts. Even if I'm a pastor out at the South Campus, I understand that it's the larger picture is more important than what's going on with my campus. And there's times when we'll do something that's good for the whole and not necessarily is good for South Campus. There's going to be trust running in two directions, flexible alignment. And we're honoring our limits that there's only so far we can go. In terms of preaching in a diverse situation, in a multi-church and in a multi-church, I think the shift is multiple voices. Now, in a multiple voices, preaching has been a solo act in most places. And obviously in a multi-valent church or a multi-site church, you have to have multiple preachers. The only time you don't do that is when you have a video venue situation. But even where the preacher is being videoed out to all these places, you still got a campus pastor. Have you ever seen a campus pastor that took the video and then they segued in and then they sort of finished it with an invitation to communion and suddenly that was that campus pastor? It's a partnership. We also see a lot of video venue where 30 Sundays a year you have video and the other 20 Sundays the campus pastor's preaching. So you're developing a multitude of voices, and that campus pastor will have a particular gifting or awareness and specialization in the needs of that campus community or of her or his worship community that he leads that will be different than the senior pastor that's looking over the whole thing. So multiple voices is the big paradigm shift. Now, it's even true for single campus churches that want to be multi. If you're going to be multi, if I want to pastor a multi-church, 57-year-old white guy, I can't be, it's just not going to work to have preaching from 57-year-old white guy, even if he does a good job. Every week can't be a diet of 57-year-old white guy, the gospel according to 57-year-old white guy. It's just not going to work in a multi-situation. I have to build a team. I have to build a team of people, of voices that together we can talk gospel in ways that are going to make sense to a larger group of people and be compelling. The good news in that, the challenge, the wonder in that is we get to, anybody that wants to do multi-church, I don't care who they are, what age they are, what their ethnicity, gender, they get to convene a group of people to think about how are we going to celebrate the gospel in a way that's going to make sense and be compelling here. We've got to get other voices. One of the best practices is just simply the pastor convening groups, diverse groups of people to meet for 6 weeks just to do sermon study, just to do lectionary or to talk through a series. And then to say thanks to the group, dismiss them. They're busy people, but they come along on the journey for 6 weeks. And you talk through the stuff and you get into their world and into their mind. And maybe you even do some kind of panel discussion with your group at some point. Or you do an interview with somebody, or you share the presentation experience with some of your team. But then you dismiss him, you convene another group a few months later. One way or another, preaching has to change if we are moving from being a homogeneous church to being a heterogeneous, a multi-kind of church. Scott Crossteck has some really good thought about that. He's the executive pastor at Church of the Resurrection. When we were doing quotes a little while ago, one of his that you may have seen up there was the idea that whether it's even just a pastor doing video venue, is the whole nature of the task changes with this wider and wider group. The same illustrations no longer work for the group. If they don't work for the group, then they don't work. So you have to rethink the whole way that you communicate if you're going to widen the group that you're leading. And that may be one of the big ideas that we're trying to teach, is we're teaching people to do multi-church and specifically to do multi-site. Okay, we're out of time. The thing about multi is it is one of our major resources we're using with the multi-site training, but it's also a good resource to use for any church that's trying to move to be a more multi kind of church, according to however God is leading in that church, maybe just to be more multi-generational, than they currently are. So that's a resource that's around, and I encourage you to use it. So any other thoughts or questions? I'll be around as we wrap up. Beautiful. Thank you for being here this afternoon. And if you would like to explore Churches Planting Churches as a program to kind of help coach some churches to get out of the building and to stretch out, or to just share their good spiritual mojo with some of their neighbors, let me know, and I would love to think with you about how we could develop something in your part of the country.